Welcome, everyone, and thank you for attending the Joint Civil Service and PNA Senate event today. My name is Monica Koken, and I'm a senator on the PNA Senate. We are delighted to see such a great turnout for this virtual event. I wanted to thank everyone who submitted questions for our presenter, and we really appreciate and value your engagement in this event. Our topic today is how money flows at the U. This is a timely topic for many of us, and we hope this webinar will illuminate what the university budget is and how money is allocated. Our presenter is Julie Tonneson, Vice President for Budget and Finance and the university's Budget Director. Prior to joining the university in 1993 as a budget analyst, Vice President Tonneson served as an executive budget officer for the state of Minnesota Department of Finance, coordinating and monitoring all aspects of the Minnesota's K-12 education operating and capital budgets on behalf of the executive branch. She holds a master's degree in public affairs from the Hubert H. Humphrey School of Public Affairs. In her current role, Vice President Tonneson is responsible for advancing the excellence of the university by developing, aligning, integrating, and managing budget and finance strategies through a coordinated approach for the University of Minnesota system, serving key stakeholders in the university's leadership, the Board of Regents, academic and support leaders and finance managers, faculty and staff, executive and legislative branches of the state of Minnesota, and the general public. Without further ado, please welcome Vice President Tonneson.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to share my screen. This is a presentation that I do frequently, but customize it for the audience a bit, and the questions that have been raised help to do that quite a bit. I hope to answer a lot of the questions that were submitted as I talk through these slides, but if not, as mentioned, we'll hit them at the end. So slide 2 is just the financial organizational structure for the university. And I just want to point out that right now we have Senior Vice President for Finance and Operations, Myron Franz, is our CFO. He reports directly to the president, and a number of units report directly to him, including all of the financial aspects of the university. So I, as the budget director for the university, report to the CFO, who reports to the president. And if there's questions about the org structure, we can go through that later. But let me get to the budget. So people ask all the time, what's the size of the university's budget? And of course, there are many different ways we can answer that question. We've struck on what we think is a simplest version to be consistent externally and internally, and that is our total expenditures. And we'll talk through revenues as well. But for the year we're currently in, which started July 1 and goes through June 30th, FY22, our approved budget, all funds, is $4.1 billion. We divide that into 2 categories, sponsored and non-sponsored. And for those who aren't familiar with sponsored funds, those are dollars we get directly from the federal government, from business and industry, from the state government, and so forth, to do primarily research grants, but sometimes public service grants as well. They're highly restricted. We'll talk more about that, but they're specifically to do grants, and they're very restricted. We hold those separate, and that's what the sponsored expenditures here represents. The amount that we would plan to spend on those grants this year is $650 million. The rest of the budget, we very creatively call non-sponsored, is projected to be a $3.4 billion level for the year we're in. And we do what's called fund accounting at the University of Minnesota, which means that we keep track of the revenue that we get based on who gives it to us. And in that, it's often easy to think about it in this stoplight kind of presentation, red, yellow, and green. And the red funds are those that come from sources that restrict our use of the dollars. So we cannot use these funds for whatever we want to across the institution. The source tells us what we have to use it for in accepting those funds. And in this category, we have the state special appropriations, which the state gives us for very specific purposes and units within the university. We have federal appropriations, same thing. They go to very specific purposes. We have restricted gifts. 99% roughly of the gifts that the university receives are restricted to a particular purpose that the donor specifies. So it might be restricted to a unit. It might be restricted to a purpose. For example, we might have a donor give us a gift for the College of Liberal Arts to do with whatever that college wants. But that means we have to give it to the college. I can't take that money and give it to the School of Dentistry, for example. But it also could be very restricted as to purpose. So the donor might say, these funds are for scholarships for students in the College of Liberal Arts. And they could further say, they're for students who come from a particular background or who have particular characteristics. So there's lots of levels of restriction on the gifts. The endowment income is also then restricted. A lot of our gifts are turned into endowments. We spend the payout, and we'll talk more about this, but we spend the payout on those endowments, but they are restricted. They are given for a faculty chair, or they are given for a scholarship program. So again, that's a restricted source of income. And then our sponsored grants, as I mentioned, those are from the federal government, state government, et cetera, to do a very specific research project for a period of time. And we cannot move those funds within the institution. Those are the primary restricted sources. We also then in the middle have what we call self-supporting. And these are funds that are generated by the businesses of the institution, if you will, those that sell to the public primarily. So this would be student housing, student dining, bookstores, parking, Twin Cities athletics. These units generate income based on their sales, and they use that income to support their direct expenditures, as well as to provide some funding for the infrastructure or overhead of the institution. So they are yellow because, at least for the most part, they don't have a large impact on the rest of the university's budget. They're kind of self-supporting or self-operating. And I will talk more about that too. There's a question later on about athletics, so we'll come back to that. And then the rest of the funds are what we call unrestricted. And as a budget person, these are the funds that I like the most because it gives us the most discretion in solving problems. And under unrestricted, there are two different types. In the bottom listing there, those revenues that you see, the fees, the sales and services, clinical income, and so forth, those revenues are generated by departments based on the activity that they're engaged in. And those revenues then go directly to those departments, generally speaking. Sometimes it's at the college level, sometimes, or the VP unit level, sometimes it's at the department level. But it's not evenly distributed across the institution. Not everybody runs a clinic. Not everybody sells things to the public, and so on and so forth. There's different activities that generate different revenues, and those flow to those units. So they're unrestricted in those units. They can use it for their operations, but they're not as unrestricted to the institution. The state O&M appropriation and tuition are the largest discretionary sources of income the university has. And as I mentioned, I like those the most because generally speaking, at the institutional level, we can use those funds to solve problems and address our most pressing priorities. And we'll talk more about that later. But that's how we think about the resources of the institution. They're restricted, they're self-supporting, or they're unrestricted. And this is a picture, kind of messy picture, but a picture of those sources as they flow in the institution. And we won't spend a lot of time on this, but if you want this later and want to look at it, you sure can. The most heavily restricted are on the right. All are sponsored awards where the sponsor actually says you have to spend this amount of the grant on salaries and fringe, you have to spend this amount on equipment, or you're allowed to. It's very restricted. The sort of lighter red might be restricted to purpose or to unit, but not necessarily to actual expenditure within that unit. And then the yellow are the self-supporting auxiliary operations. And then the green is the unrestricted. And that lighter green is the piece that goes directly to The departments, the darker green for operations, can be used to support all of our missions, all of our infrastructure, all of our initiatives, and so on and so forth. We can do pretty much anything legal with that dark green set of money. And here's how they split across in a pie chart form. So of the total budgeted revenues for the institution this fiscal year, $4 billion, 16% is that sponsored, heavily restricted sponsored grant pool. Another 20% are the restricted to purpose or to unit. Again, we can't move those around. The yellow, the auxiliary businesses of the institution, is 8%. The light green departmental-based unrestricted funding is 16%. And then the O&M appropriation and tuition are now at 40% of the budget. Okay. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the state appropriation in particular. And I want to, actually, let me go back one, because this is where I did want to answer one question. Somebody had the question about the endowment and how it supports the university. And now in particular, when we are earning quite a bit in interest income on our endowment, that question has come up a lot more. The endowment earnings are in that lighter red, the fire engine red part of the budget. They go, how it works is when let's say a donor gives us enough money to create an endowment for scholarships, that becomes a principal that is not spent. And what the university spends is the earnings off of that endowment. And every year, the department that is supposed to get the funds based on the restrictions will get the 4.5% payout on a 60-month, like a 5-year rolling average is how it works. So as the endowment starts earning more revenue, that does automatically end up in departments based on the restrictions where it's supposed to go, automatically ends up there over a period of years. So it ramps up in terms of growth. And on the downside, if there is a decrease in interest earnings, it will ramp down. Those funds are very important to the institution because they do support a lot of activity that the departments find important related to faculty chairs and scholarships most often. But again, we can't move those funds around the institution. So if there's more questions on that, we'll get back to them later, but I did want to touch on that just briefly while we were there. This slide, now I'm going to jump to the state support to the university. This slide shows where the state money goes, the state general fund revenue, which is supported by income and sales tax. That's the majority of the general fund. And for the biennium we're currently in, the 2 years, FY22 and 23, you can see that the state has allocated 31% of their general fund resources to health and human services, 40% to E through 12 education. They are constitutionally required to support the education system, E12, as well as some of the health and human services activities. That's 71% of the state budget goes there. The higher education piece is 7%, and that has changed over time, and I will show you that here in a moment. But it's a significant amount. I mean, it's more than state government, for example, but it has been decreasing. People talk about, well, we need to just cut state agencies when there's a budget problem. The state government piece of the pie, sort of all the rest of the little state agencies, the collection is pretty small at 3%. The real big money goes to E12 education and health and human services programming. And as I mentioned, it has been decreasing to higher ed over time. This is a picture of from 1990 through now, through today, and how the state support just in nominal terms, in dollar terms, has reduced in terms of what goes to higher education. Back in 1990, it was 14.5% of that pie chart that I just showed you. Today, it is just under 7 at 6.91%. It also plots on here the University of Minnesota, which is the maroon line, and the Minnesota State piece, which is the blue line. Higher education in the state of Minnesota incorporates the University of Minnesota, Minnesota State, the Office of Higher Education, and the state grant program, which is a financial aid program for Minnesota students. Those four pieces are represented in the higher ed total. Here I've just plotted Minnesota State and the University of Minnesota, which is the bulk of the money. And you can see that it is tracked, we've tracked very closely to Minnesota State over time, often getting the same quote share of the state budget. In recent years, Minnesota State has picked up a little bit. They have gotten more funding than the University of Minnesota. So we're sitting right now at 2.7% of the state's general fund. Minnesota State is at 3.1%. If you go back to that 1990 period, this chart shows you that in terms of spending per capita as compared to all other states in the union, Minnesota was really supporting higher education at a high level in the 1990 to 2000 time period. We were in the top 5 to 10 within the country. We got a big cut and jumped down to 25, actually right in the middle of the country in 2012. And we have kind of been working our way back up or down, however you want to think about it. And for 21, the last bar that we had data on to compare, we were 20th out of 50. So we are inching our way back up to the top 10, but not back there yet. The state appropriations actually come to the university in a number of different ways. Above the blue line here, you see the operations and maintenance, or the O&M appropriation. That is the large unrestricted block grant to the institution. And you can see it's $621 million this year and next year. Between the two blue lines, those are the state special appropriations I mentioned briefly. These are the restricted ones. So in law, it tells us, this is actual language from the law, we have to give those dollar amounts to those activities within the institution. The ag special, the health sciences special, it's called Institute of Technology, that goes to the College of Science and Engineering. The system special, which is a miscellaneous group. And then we have the U-Mail partnership funds. Below the blue line, and I should say that the O&M appropriation and the state specials, those all come from the state's general fund, that pie chart I showed you previously. Below the blue line, we also get operating appropriations from non-general fund state sources. So we get 2.2 million from the Healthcare Access Fund, which is the provider tax, healthcare provider tax that supports that. That goes to the, it actually goes to the medical school. And then a number of schools across our academic health units get a portion of $22,250,000, which comes from the cigarette tax every year. And again, those are to support general operations for those units. We get other state funding. So mentioned at the bottom here, the LCCMR, Legislative Citizens Commission on Minnesota Resources, does provide biennially sponsored type grants based on applications. So we get that kind of funding, we get contract funding, we get a number of different types that are much more specific to a situation, a project, or a program grant, for example. But those are the big pieces for operations. Our tuition and state funding, those two large discretionary sources of income, prior to 2010, our state appropriation revenue exceeded our tuition revenue. That ended in that time period where we were cut significantly. After 2008, we had a couple large cuts, and the university at that time chose to increase tuition to help offset that reduction in a state appropriation. Didn't cover it, but it helped offset a little bit. But since that time, tuition has exceeded the state appropriation. And we, by the way, are treated well by our state compared to many of our Big Ten peers. A number of them crossed that line many, many years ago. Their tuition has exceeded their state support for many years. The tuition, I'll spend a few minutes on tuition now. We have worked really hard at the institution to hold our undergraduate tuition rates down, our resident undergraduate tuition rates. So this is a little bit of history going back to 2013 to the 2015 period where we held tuition rates flat. So we increased them when we were cut in the 2008 to 2012 period, but then we held them flat for several years. And you can see here that we've had flat rates a number of times since then. And even when we didn't hold them flat, we have kept them within the rate of inflation or less. So over this period of time, the average annual increase in tuition rates for the Twin Cities campus has been 1.3, and for the other campuses has been 0.6 or 0.7%. So we've worked really hard to do that. And it's hard to do that when your costs are going up more than this rate of inflation and the state doesn't give you money. But we can talk more about that coming up as well. The non-resident tuition rates has been a little bit different story. This is on the Twin Cities campus. A couple of our campuses, Rochester and the Crookston campus, do not have a different non-resident rate. So that doesn't apply to them. Duluth does and Morris does, but they have been increasing on their campuses at very modest and small increases. The Twin Cities made a concerted effort in this time period you see here, 2015 and on, to increase the non-resident tuition rate significantly. We were the lowest in the Big Ten, and we got direction from the board that said we need to be closer to the middle of the Big Ten. And to do that, as all those other institutions have been increasing their rates as well, we had to jump it rather quickly and rather high rates. So you see in 2018, 2019, we were greater than 10% increases in the rate. We did have a program that allowed us to charge continuing students no more than a 5.5% increase, but the rate itself that the new freshmen would pay every year went up at these levels. Last year for 21, we kept it flat, and this year we are sitting at a roughly 1.5% increase. I don't see us going back to those high 10, 12% increases anytime soon on that rate. Just one quick word about graduate and professional tuition. We allow our professional schools to propose tuition rate changes based on their particular markets. And I won't go into that for the interest of time, but they're all different in how they look at their tuition rates and how they compare. Our graduate student rates, their general graduate rate flows as the undergraduate rate does. So if it goes up 1.5% on the undergraduate side, we increase 1.5% on the graduate side. Some professional programs, not professional, some departmental master's programs that are graduate level also have market-based rates. So it does depend on what others are charging on that one. This is how the revenue splits, the tuition revenue splits in terms of who pays the tuition revenue. And across the whole system, over a third, 35%, now comes from our Twin Cities resident undergraduate students. The graduate, the blue piece, the Twin Cities graduate tuition is 21%. That's large compared to many of our peers. We have a relatively large number of graduate students at the University of Minnesota. And then you can see the professional, the Twin Cities non-resident undergraduate, and Duluth are somewhat similar in that 11 to 15% range. And then the Crookston, Morris, and Rochester campuses are small in terms of total dollar revenue generated. About $1 billion though. It's a significant source of income to the institution. And this is a picture really of what we have done over time to keep diversifying our revenues. It's important for us not to be too dependent on just one. So what we have done though, is you can see over time that dark maroon bar, which represents our state appropriation, has decreased as a percent of our total revenue. In 1989, it was 39% of our total revenue. Today, it's 17%. What's taken over? Tuition has grown as a percent of our total revenue from 12% to 24%. But in addition to that, we've worked really hard on all those other revenues, the sales income, the gift generation, and so forth, so that all of our other revenues have also grown from 49% to 59%. And that's something our board has wanted us to work at pretty hard. And we try to create incentives for units to generate that income. Just a word on our, and that, by the way, excluded our sponsored research. This chart shows you a little bit about where our sponsored research comes from and where it happens within the institution. Keep in mind, we have a three-part mission: instruction, research, public service. The tuition comes from the instruction side. The research revenues that are generated are the sponsored grants and the ICR, indirect cost recovery, overhead money that comes along with that. Our primary sponsors are on the left side, and we are very diverse. Again, compared to other institutions, we have the whole health side of the equation. We have the science side of the equation. We have the agricultural side of the equation. We have a very comprehensive program set. So our sponsors are very diverse. The largest sponsor is NIH, the National Institutes of Health, and at 9%, NSF is also, as a single entity, the second largest. The other 9% there is private foundations, and then the maroon, the 13%, is state and local government. So it comes from a lot of places. Where does it go within the institution? The big players in research within the institution, not surprising, are the medical school, our College of Science and Engineering. The School of Public Health as a single unit is also very dependent on sponsored grants, but our College of Education and Human Development does extremely well in generating grant income, as does our College of Food, Agricultural, and Natural Resource Sciences. Some schools are not in that game. The College of Liberal Arts, for example, the Humphrey School, some places don't have the opportunity because the work that they do is not part of these primarily federally funded, but sometimes even state and foundation funded programs. And this chart is the last revenue chart I want to share today. This is a summary of revenues by unit, and the units included here are all of our academic units, which is the colleges on the Twin Cities campus, Extension and the Experiment Station, as well as each of our system campuses. And it shows you a couple things. It shows you the relative size of these units. The medical school is huge. It's roughly by itself 1/6 of the university's budget. The Experiment Station is our smallest academic unit at 13 million. That compares to the $761 million budget for the medical school in revenues. But it also shows you what they're dependent on. So if you look at that sort of royal blue color, that's tuition. And as an example, the College of Liberal Arts, the third one from the bottom, the Duluth campus, more in the middle is the Carlson School of Management, extremely dependent on tuition. They care a lot about what we do with tuition policy, what happens to impact enrollment. Those things matter a lot to them. The medical school, conversely, the royal blue portion is very small. They have a set number of students. They don't change their tuition a lot. It's not important to as important to them as a source. The medical school cares a lot more about the grant and contract world. That's what drives almost half of their budget. It also shows you where the state money goes, which is the green bar. We do not distribute our state appropriation by formula. The state appropriation that's restricted goes where the law says. The O&M portion is by decision, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But this is how it has ended up. The medical school, just by virtue of its size and some of the state directed or intended programming, goes to the medical school. But you can see that each one of these does get a portion of their budget funded by our state appropriation. I want to spend just a couple minutes on the expenditure side here before we get into the budget process. The total non-sponsored, so take those sponsored grants out, the non-sponsored spending of the institution this year is going to be $3.4 billion is our estimate. On the left, it shows you how that splits out by what we call object of expenditure. Salaries and fringe is 62% of our business. We are a people place. The rest of it, you can see 12% is student aid, 11% supplies and services, and then much smaller splits for the other categories. On the right, it shows that same 3.4 billion, but it's by function. So every time you spend $1 here, there is a coding attached to the account that you're spending from that indicates what that is generally for. Is it related to instruction? Is it related to scholarships and so on and so forth? The functions. Those functions are defined by IPEDS, the Integrated Post-Secondary Education Data System, that we have to report into in order to compare spending across institutions. Any institution that gets federal money has to do that reporting so we can compare. They give us the definitions, we apply them, and this is how the dollars flow according to that. The research portion here is small because this excludes our sponsored activity. This is only the non-sponsored funded, all those other funds and what they, and the portion of that spending is on research is 11%. As I said, we're a people place. We have, this is going back in time to show that we have had 2 salary freezes since FY12. We actually had one in FY10 as well. But since then, we have worked hard to be able to fund sort of an inflationary level of compensation increase across the institution, 2 to 2.5%. This year, we were only able to do 1.5% coming out of the pandemic, coupled with our revenues that were available. So just a little bit of time history for you, but that is a major component of balancing the annual budget. The rest of this expenditures really fluctuate quite a bit. So this is the percentage change in total expenditures unadjusted for inflation since 2015. And you can see they really vary. We've had decreases in expenditure last year to as much as a 4% or 4.2% increase from the prior year. A lot of that fluctuation has to do with some of the really volatile categories of spending, particularly related to equipment and professional services, which really swing up and down. So if we had one big contract for a system replacement, for example, that's going to really push the spending up in a year over the prior year. And then the next year it goes away. And so the spending really drops. It's difficult to gauge total. It's really difficult to tell what's going on if you just look at total expenditures year to year, because there's so much underneath the hood that varies year to year. We do have listed here on the bottom some of the spending categories that tend to grow faster than the rate of inflation in a higher ed institution. And it's just something that we have to deal with. But every year we have to put additional money into fringe benefits for our employees, into our service, some of our services that increase. As you see there, library journal subscriptions is a great example. The inflation rate on that has been high in the last 10 years. Health and safety issues, different things, different components of our budget that no matter what we do, they seem to grow faster than the rate of inflation, which is something that we have to solve for. So getting then to what we have to solve for, we better take a look at my time here. I want to talk through the budget process a little bit. And we have 2, what I would call budget processes every year. We have the biennial budget request to the state that we complete every 2 years because they're operating on a 2-year cycle. And then we have our own annual budget process that we do inside every year. And it's not high math here. This is just like you would do at home. We look at the available resources we have. We look at the costs and investments, the costs that we have to pay, the investments that we want to pay, and the 2 have to balance. We spend a lot of time in the budget process going into depth in terms of planning around tuition and our state O&M appropriation. And so a lot of what I'm going to talk about is the process related to those 2 funding sources. The reason for that is all of the other revenue activity and the expenses that are funded by those other revenues, they vary by unit based on the activity that the particular unit is engaged in. And so they're managed at the unit level. And if the revenue is growing, they can grow their spending. If the revenue isn't growing, they have to curtail their spending. They are responsible for balancing the budgets related to those other funds. We don't, as an institution, come in and take those funds. We don't give them to other units. We just don't do that. And so that's managed more at the unit level. The institutional budget process focuses on making decisions about tuition rates, and so that we can use that income for our costs and investments, and on where the state O&M appropriation is going to go and how much we're going to ask for from the state of Minnesota. Because again, those two sources are the two that we can use to, pay to keep the lights on, plus fund new safety programs, plus fund new academic faculty hiring, and so on and so forth. We can do anything with those funds. And so they provide the most opportunity for balancing the budget. The timeline for this starts in the summer of an even numbered year for the full budget development cycle, because in the summer of an even numbered year, we spend time thinking about what are we going to ask for from the state of Minnesota for the next 2 years. That's our biennial request to the state, but we can't do that in a vacuum. So we create what we call a high-level budget framework, where we talk about what do we need the next 2 years in terms of increased tuition, increased state money, maybe increased and continuing internal reallocation of existing resources in order to pay for what kind of compensation increases do we want to provide to our employees, what kind of program do we want to invest in maybe to support the strategic plan, what are the costs that we know we're going to have to cover, such as utilities and fringe benefits and so forth. And in that black box there, that framework development is a really high level then 30,000 foot incremental look at the budget that balances. We're going to plan for these revenue increases and these cost increases, and it has to balance. Really high level, simple math. We do that every 2 years. And then from there, we take the state component of that and run it through the state process to request funding from the state. That starts in the summer. We submit it after the board approves our request in October, goes through the legislative process, and finally we know our appropriation in May of the odd numbered year, and we'll know the appropriation for the next 2 years. Simultaneously, we're building that first year annual budget for the institution. So even though we don't know for sure what our state money is going to be, we have to move forward with planning. So we work with all of our support units in the fall. We work with our academic units in the winter. And when we know that state appropriation and we know what all the needs and priorities are of the units, we have to pull it all together in the spring to create that balanced budget that we bring to the board. The second year of the biennium, we don't have to completely start over because we know what our state appropriation is. We will tweak what's in that black box the second year. Maybe we thought we were going to do a tuition increase of 2%. Now we've changed it to 2.5%. We can tweak it. But we don't have to completely start from scratch, but it is the same internal process than the second year of the biennium until we know the budget that we bring to the board in June for review and approval. So it starts over then the next year with the black box in the following even numbered summer. The players in the budget process are identified here. The president is the one that really decides those things in that big black box, that what are we going to do for comp, tuition, and so forth. And then she has delegated to what's called the budget committee, the budget process. The budget committee is me, the CFO, the provost, the vice president for research, and the vice president for clinical academic affairs. Working as institutional officers, we then turn those assumptions in the black box into budget instructions to units. We send those out to the units. We meet with every unit every year to talk through whatever their issues are and their opportunities and their priorities. And they have to respond. So we send them the instructions, then the chancellors, deans, and vice presidents are responsible for responding to the instructions with their plans and their priorities and answering all the questions we send them about the budget. How they want to involve their departments is their choice. So sometimes they do it very robustly and have internal processes with lots of consultation, and sometimes they don't. It's up to them how they want to build that budget. Ultimately, what comes through this process is the budget committee takes all that information after meeting with the units. We make recommendations to the president on allocations of the state money, on tuition rates that might be different for the different professional programs or campuses and so forth, on fees, on anything that comes through the process. We make recommendations to the president. It's an iterative back and forth kind of process. Ultimately, she decides what she wants to bring forward to the board for review and action in the spring. Along the way, we have a lot of consultations built into our annual schedule. We meet with lots of different groups and anyone who asks for an update basically on the budget, we will talk about it whenever we can and whenever we have updated information. When I said we meet with all of the units, these are the units. These are what we call our Resource Responsibility Centers, or RRCs. We have about 50 of them. The academic ones are listed on the left, those of the Twin Cities and those on the Greater Minnesota or system campuses. On the right, we have all of the support units. They are, some of them have institution-wide responsibilities like the budget office. Some are mixed, where they have Twin Cities centered responsibilities as well as institution-wide responsibilities. The asterisk next to some of them means that during the budget process, they are treated just like an academic unit for purposes of the budget process and the budget model. So I'll make that clear as we come up here on another slide, but these are the units that are responsible for managing the financial activities of their unit. We don't work with departments, in other words. How you're determined to be an academic unit is two things. If your primary mission is instruction, research, or public service, and if you generate revenues based on the activities you're engaged in. Generally speaking, you are an academic unit. And it could sound like the auxiliaries that we treat as academic units because they generate revenue to cover their activities. The support units, conversely, they exist to provide oversight, monitoring, special services, and subject matter expertise to the academic missions of the institution. Generally, they do not generate revenues. Now, you probably have heard about a budget model that we use in this process. And I just want to let you know that a budget model does not make budget decisions. What is a budget model? So a budget model is it's a tool. It's a set of decision rules around how we're going to attribute revenues and allocate costs in a way that helps us get to a decision process. The budget model itself does not make the decisions. It doesn't set goals and objectives or priorities or mission, vision, or anything like that. It's just a set of rules. And in a traditional higher education budget model, the state appropriation, the indirect cost recovery revenue generated off of grants, and tuition revenue are all combined into one, and they're commingled, and central administration allocates those out annually on a base plus minus process usually to every academic unit and every support unit. That is a traditional higher ed model. What we have at the University of Minnesota is called a responsibility center management model, where we have made the decision to distribute the accountability for budget management down to the unit level. And so what do? Over on the right was how we first got into this, and I think it just helps you to understand the revenue side of this. The state appropriation still comes central, and it gets allocated out to only our academic units, which I'll show you. But the indirect cost recovery revenue and the tuition revenue go 100% to the academic units that generate them. When we first started it, the ICR was split 50-50, but it visually shows you that we're breaking apart the tripart revenues on the left and saying, nope, we're going to give some of those revenues directly to the units that generate them. And so our model today is best depicted here. I think this is the simplest way to think about it. Our tuition goes 100% to the units that generate it, 75% based on unit of instruction, 25% on unit of enrollment. All the rest of the revenues, 100% to the units that generate them, sometimes at the department, sometimes at the college level. The state appropriation then, the box on the bottom there on the left, goes 100% in a base plus minus annual process based on decision only to the academic RRCs. So to our Twin Cities colleges and our system campuses. So 100% of the revenues of the institution effectively are in the academic units. That means they have to have 100% of the cost. So they use those revenues to pay for their direct faculty and equipment and travel, etc. They pay also a portion of all the overhead costs of the institution. We set budgets for all of our support unit RRCs, and they go into one of these 9 major cost pools that then get charged out to the academic units annually. But that doesn't make the decisions. It only sets us up to make the decisions. And I'll give you an example here in a minute. I'm going to skip this piece just for the interest of time. This just shows you the cost pools, those 9 major cost pools, and how much they are for the current year. Adds up to $583 million. Because I want to give you one example of how that support unit process works. For our IT cost pool, which is primarily the Office of Information Technology, we determine through the budget process and meeting with them in the fall what their budget needs are, what we expect them to reallocate internally to help cover their cost increases, how much we think we need to give them in additional funding to operate if we have the funding, and so forth. So we come up with a decision, and this time it happens to be an $81 million allocation. That's the budget for OIT. That gets put into the technology cost pool, which then gets distributed out to all of our academic units as an expense, as a charge, based on their proportionate share of some statistic. And for the technology pool, the statistic is headcount. It's faculty, staff, and student headcount. And because our technology, Office of Information Technology, provides some services that are campus-based, a portion of that $81 million is charged only to the Twin Cities campus. And some of what they do is institution-wide. So a portion of that $81 million is charged to all units of the institution. And every cost pool works that same way. It's just a different dollar amount and a different statistic that distributes the expense, okay? And I'm going to skip that other slide and go to this one, which is pulling this all together as an example. How does it work? And this is what I call the 3-legged stool of resource allocation. Starting at the bottom is the first leg of the stool, that central decision-making process, which is that black box. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? What is the vision mission for the institution that we then turn into the black box, which is the second leg of the stool up on the left there, that framework. If we decide we're going to increase tuition 2%, we're going to increase comp 2%, and we're going to add police officers as an example. The budget model then helps us translate those high-level decisions down to the unit level so we can make decisions there and how to implement the budget. If we're going to increase 2%, tuition 2%, the budget model tells me how much the College of Design is going to earn. If we're going to increase comp, I know how much they're going to have to pay for that. If we're going to add police officers because of the cost pools, I know how much that's going to cost that college. We then set up a framework for that college that says, do you have enough revenue increase to cover your cost increases or not? If not, maybe you have to cut your budget more than we intended. Maybe we have to take from an O&M from another unit to help you out because that other unit maybe has an excess of revenue. Maybe we want to leave an excess of revenue with you to do more programmatic investment. I'm rushing here because of time, but there's a lot that goes into that process where the budget model allows us to create a framework for decision-making that then requires a decision by leadership that we take to the president, and she ultimately decides what to take to the board. So that's how the budget process works. And this is an example from this year for our College of Biological Sciences in terms of the planned incremental changes in resources of 1.882 million, the tuition, the internal reallocation, a little bit more O&M, to pay for the incremental increases in compensation, their cost pool charges, some investments that they are directed to make, and then they were also short on tuition the prior year, so we had to cover that. It just shows you that every one of these units has a different framework when we're done and a different set of decisions based on what they need given their particular characteristics. And I think I'm going to stop there. The last slide was only about why our budget model works for us at the institution, but we can go into that if anybody has questions on it. I want to leave at least a few minutes here for questions And I hope I answered some of them that you sent in, but if not, I'm happy to answer them now. So I'll shut up.
What a way to close.
Yeah, there's a lot of information.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that was a lot of really great information. We do have a couple questions that came in the Q&A. So with the time we have left, we can maybe get to a few of these. Just right now, would you be okay if we send you any questions we don't get to afterwards, and then we can follow up with the recording and the slides? Would you be okay with that? Okay, wonderful.
Yes, absolutely.
All right, so I'll start with the ones that kind of got the most upvotes here. So the first question I have is, could you share any insights regarding how the university is currently thinking about capital expenses going forward? Specifically, what is being considered regarding the possibility of expense reductions and or revenue generation, as if the amount of physical space needed is lower after the pandemic due to the people continuing to work or learn from home to a greater degree than has been historically? What kind of impact might this have on the budget?
Sure.
Sorry, I was trying to kind of make that a little bit briefer because it's, there's a lot in that question. So did you get what the question is?
I think so. So let me just say that I obviously was focusing on the operating budget. There is a whole nother process for the capital budget and for facilities. And a portion of that we ask for from the state of Minnesota, a portion of that we sell our own debt or we get gifts and so on and so forth to fund our facility needs. There's a lot going on there right now. We have a huge deferred maintenance problem, over $5 billion deferred maintenance problem. So we always are asking for money from the state to help with that. That's not going to go away. The interesting question about what's happening now after the pandemic is we have been working toward alternate work arrangements for many years. And so some people have been doing that even before the pandemic. Now that more of us work at home, it's accelerated that planning. But what happens is that it's mostly administrative office type buildings that are going to be impacted. We still have a lot of space where that requires people to be there. So we have a lot of labs. We have a lot of clinical space. We have a lot of teaching space where people want to be there. So that is all going to continue. We are going to continue to try to upgrade that and so on. What we're going to work to get rid of is a lot of office space that we don't need in ways that we can actually reduce our square footage in some areas, which will lower the operating cost for facilities. But again, because we're not getting rid of everything and because new facilities actually cost a lot to operate, I see some impact on the budget, but it's not going to be immediate and it's not going to be a solution to our budget problems. I hope that's a quick answer.
No, great. Thank you for that. The next question we have is there a possibility compensation planning at the university budget level can happen up front instead of on the back end of the budget planning process? Why or why not?
Yeah, compensation is tricky. I will say, and there was a question too about whether or not we'll ever be able to actually afford our market refinement information. So generally speaking, we think about compensation in a couple ways. One is cost of living, and one is those extra market issues that are more refined and more targeted within the institution. We're working hard to think about how to pull that second piece into the prior planning, so on the front end of planning, so that we can say we're going to invest this amount in that. We do it sporadically, but we're trying to work through a process even right now to make that more of a standard part of the process. But it is hard. I mean, we have to plan on the front end in order to build that framework I was talking about. But to go too much in advance is impossible when you don't know what your state money is going to be year to year. So we're trying.
Oh, great. Thank you for that. Let's see. We have time for maybe one more question. I will sneak in this one comment. We did have somebody say that it would be nice to have salary and fringe separated by hard and soft costs, like operations and management of assets versus program salaries, to give a more accurate picture of compensation expenses. That was a comment.
Not
that we
even
had
sure,
from-
actually, I'm not even sure what, I'd have to ask a little bit more about what that means when you say soft or not. Compensation, the true compensation that we plan for is only the recurring obligations we have for our employee base. So if you have one-time compensation costs, that is handled, actually all one-time expenditures are kind of handled differently than the ongoing recurring base increases in the budget.
Okay, yep, that makes sense. It was a comment that we had, so we wanted to pass that along. The last question I think we'll have time for here
Yep.
is during the COVID pandemic, several units within the GPS Alliance were severely affected by the downturn in global mobility because those units budgets are mostly funded through student fees. Will there be any attention to those budgets to make them more stable in case we see additional limitations in study abroad and international student mobility?
Yeah, well, first of all, on the pandemic, we spent a lot of time going through unit by unit to understand the impacts, and we're still doing that. And trying to help units with their unique situations get through the pandemic, and we want to get them the funding they need if we have it available. So the federal funding and the central reserves and so forth needs to get to the places that have it as an issue. And actually GPS was part of that. And so we've been helping them. But I think as I mentioned earlier, every unit is unique in the revenues that it generates and the costs that it has. And if your activity changes significantly, there would be a transition time to kind of arrive at a new base. But if we're in a new world where there is a permanent change, we have to figure out what we need to look like then in that new world. And do we need the same level of services? Do we need the same services? Or do we need to shift? And if we shift, the funding source could shift. But we have to be strategic about that. I mean, there is no automatic answer. There's no, yep, we're automatically going to backfill those student fees, even though they're going to be gone forever. That's not, we need to understand a little bit more about what's going on so we can make the smart decisions about the future for that unit.
Great. Well, thank you so much. We are just about at time, so that's all we have time for now. We'll share these other questions with you. But otherwise, I will pass it over to Megan to do our closing.
Thanks, Chris. My name is Megan Murray. I'm a senator on the, sorry, my video's off. I'm a senator on the Civil Service Senate and University Senates. Vice President Tonneson, on behalf of the Civil Service and PNA Senates, we want to thank you for speaking to us today about the university's budget and how it works. This is so complicated and interesting, especially for the last 19 months with COVID. These are great things to know. This was really interesting and we really appreciate your time today. And thank you again for talking with us.
You're very welcome. And I apologize, I had to go so fast and talk fast, and there's a lot there. And if you ever want to delve into more of it, please just let me know. I'm happy to come back.
We are going to, and I'm glad this was recorded too. So that was nice. Thanks for letting us do that. For our civil service and PNA colleagues, please consider running or participating in subcommittees on the Senate, because every voice matters and it's good to have other participation and eyes. If you're interested in learning more about university governance, please visit the University Senate website at senate.umn.edu. Thank you so much for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your day.